Welcome back to the Wealth Builder podcast. I'm your host, Nick Donato, financial advisor at Guidance Financial. Today, we're tackling something that's on the minds of lots of parents. How do you actually plan to save for your child's education costs? Because whether it's school fees, university, extracurricular activities, sports, dance, or music, education doesn't come cheap, and getting a plan in place early can make a real difference. Joining me today is Marie Lazar from Futurity Investment Group, one of Australia's specialists in education bonds. Marie's going to walk us through how education bonds work, who they're right for, and how they fit into a broader wealth building plan. Before we dive in, a quick note, everything we discuss today is general in nature and doesn't take your personal situation into account. Before making any decisions, it's worth getting advice on the specifics for your situation. So let's jump in. So Marie, thanks for joining me today. So yeah, we're chatting about education, funding, and why it matters and how it works. And there's lots of different options that people can choose: independent or private, public or Catholic. So many choices to make when it comes to children's education.
That's right.
Um, but why does education funding matter?
Mm. Well, as you mentioned, education is important to thrive in life in general, but every year the school costs are rising across the private, public, and Catholic sectors. So, to give you a bit of an idea, I have some interesting figures to share from our cost of education research that Futurity shares via the news at the start of every year. So, the national average cost to send your child to government school for 13 years, if they were to start prep in 2026, would be $113,594 to the total 13 years of school, starting from this year onwards. And that includes ancillary costs such as uniforms, laptops, and textbooks, which makes up about 90% of this total cost. And when it comes to Catholic school, the total cost would be $247,174 for 13 years of school for a child starting school this year. And then when it comes to the total cost for independent school, it'll be $369,594 from 2026. Now, this is the national average cost, so it does vary from state to state. But interestingly, the total cost for government school actually decreased from last year nationally, mainly because some cities, such as Sydney, abolished public school fees. So, despite government school fees dropping, it's all those ancillary costs that they need. But when it's independent and Catholic school, the total cost has increased. So, for independent school, the total cost went up by about 5.55% from 2025. And for Catholic school, it actually jumped up to almost 28% from last year. So,
So
it's a
some
big.
big costs in there, definitely. And, when you're planning for them, inflation is quite high at the moment, but school
Correct.
fees almost double or triple inflation. So schooling seems to be getting, more expensive over time as everything else does, I guess.
It does. But interestingly, despite the rising cost of education, a lot of families still want to send their children to Catholic and independent schools. So,
Hmm.
according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, enrolments towards Catholic and independent schools have surged in the last 5 years. So, independent school enrolments have increased by just over 15%, and Catholic school enrolments have increased by just over 6% since 2021. So the demand for high quality education is there, but as you say, with rising living costs, everyday families are struggling to meet that rising cost of education, which is on average more than double the rate of inflation. So families really need to start planning early to be able to meet these costs now and in the future.
Yeah, and especially with the independent schools or the private schools, a lot of them you know your kid is born and by the time they're 1 or 2 or 6 months, you have to put them on a list for certain schools
Hmm.
to get them in the door if that's the path that you decide to go down, or even to keep that option open
Yes.
and decide later. So
Mm.
we think of where we're going to send them, so we may as well have a conversation about how we're going to fund it in 5 years' time, if it's for
Mm.
primary school when they're 5, or when they're starting high school in a couple more years down the track. So yeah,
But
starting early is probably a good tip.
I agree. Gives you more options for later.
And one of the things on the ancillary costs,
Mm.
might see people underestimate those. You've got camps and sports, and
Hmm.
you can never really estimate that, 'cause your child might take up basketball, which might be
Yeah.
slightly cheaper than horse riding. Who knows?
Well, that's it. And you don't want your children to miss out on those extracurricular activities that make school a lot more enjoyable and enriching as well. So they need to be factored into.
hmm hmm So yeah, we see, I don't know, a lot of people have a plan of where they want them to go, but then how they're going to fund that.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, that's placed on the back burner, so to speak. And there's heaps of different options that people look at, from high interest bank accounts, shares, other investment products, portfolios. But I guess where you and Futurity come into it is around the education bond side of things, which
Mm.
might not be too commonly known out there. So did you want to
Hmm.
take us through what an education bond even is?
Yes, pleasure. So an education bond is an investment vehicle that allows you to invest through a variety of investment options. And it's made up of two components. Number one, your contributions component. We call that the capital component. And then the second component is the investment growth earnings. So when your investment earnings balance starts to grow and you're going to withdraw from that component to fund an education expense, the education bond provider, Futurity in this instance, will actually give you a 30% tax credit within your education bond. So that's a unique tax benefit that's available to those that own education bonds, and it's more like a reward that you want to be self-sufficient in planning and funding your children's education, regardless of what school they are at.
So you get a tax credit when you pull the funds out. How is it taxed? Is it,
Mm,
internally taxed, or do I
that's
pay
it.
tax on the earnings? How does that work? Because
No, that's a very good point. That's a very important part of the education bond is that it's considered a tax paid investment. So similar to superannuation, where superannuation's taxed at that 15% tax rate on the earnings and the super fund's paying that. With an education bond, the bond provider's paying tax on that earnings at most 30%, which is our company tax rate. So we're paying the tax on behalf of you, the bond owner, and that's where we actually use our credit to actually give you back some of that tax if it's used for education purposes.
yep. So we did an episode on franking credits a little while back. So
Yes.
similar to a franking credit, where you get the tax back or the tax reduced.
You do tax reduced depending on the investment option you select. If it is an Australian shares option, you do get franking credits. If it's international shares, there's foreign tax credits. So we've got these very helpful formulas that we use to work out how do we reduce that tax rate. We can get that tax rate even lower, even closer to 20%. So it would definitely suit most people that are working on at least 30% marginal tax rate.
Cool. And when we withdraw for school fees,
Mm.
laptop, uh, camps, or whatever it
Mhm.
may be, do we have to, keep evidence and tell you, hey, this is for mm, term
Yes.
one fees, or what does that look like?
Well, we actually don't ask for receipts. So Futurity is unique in that way. Some other bond providers might ask for receipts, but we always recommend that you hang on to the receipts because The credit does come from the ATO, and if you were to be audited, it'd be very helpful that you had the receipts just like you would on a tax return. But for us to make those claims processes really smooth, we don't actually require the receipts when you make that education claim.
No worries, too easy, and it can be for anything. And if it was outside of, I, what people, I guess, want to know is their money locked up? If it was outside of an education
Mm,
expense and the car blows up and we've got no money to
yeah.
spend, can we access some of it, or is it stuck there for 5, 10, 20 years?
Oh, very good question. So one thing that we are very proud of is the flexibility of being able to access your money when you need it. So that capital component I mentioned, so every dollar you're contributing into the bond, and that capital component is always available to you. So you can actually access your own money back tax-free for any purpose from day one. So there's no lock-in period on accessing your own capital. But when it comes to the earnings for education, that you can also do from day one. But if you want to make sure it's tax-free for any purpose, that earnings component, there's a 10-year rule on that. So best to wait after 10 years to access funds from the earnings tax-free, but you've also got the option to take money from the capital component tax-free for non-education purposes.
Yep. And at the moment, capital gains tax, very topical with
Yes.
changes and all of, the budget and everyone
Hmm.
freaking out, so to speak. Is that, yeah, withdrawing it tax free? Do we pay capital gains tax on it, or is it completely tax free?
It is tax-free from the capital component at all times. So one good thing to come out of the budget is that our education bonds are basically not impacted from all those tax proposals from the budget. CGT doesn't have the same effect on bonds, on education bonds. We build that into the internal tax rate when we actually pay tax on the earnings, and it doesn't personally impact the bond owner. Unless they were to take the earnings out within the 10 years, there may be a tax impact, but largely speaking, it's not to do with the CGT proposals.
Gotcha. So best to wait the 10 years to get the
Yes,
income component, and then
correct.
the other stuff we can take out if need be. But
Correct.
hopefully we don't need to because we've planned that and it's put aside for the kids and school
Definitely.
fees and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I've got two kids. Do you have
Mm.
one for child one and one for child two? Or do we
Okay.
have one combined that we can just access as a thing? How does that work?
You've got both options. You can have one bond per child, or I like the family bond that we have, where you can have up to 10 beneficiaries on one bond. What I like about that is that it allows you to build up a bigger bucket of earnings so that if one child was to go to university and one child wasn't going to go to university, you could allocate the earnings to the one that does take their education journey further and then maybe pay out the one that doesn't go to university from the capital. You've got more options to get as much tax credits as you can. So it's really up to the parent or grandparent how they want to operate their bond. But I do think there's something valuable about having the two beneficiaries on the one bond.
Okay. Two is available. And talking about myself, I've got a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. So
Mm.
if I started one for my before my 2-year-old came around,
Mm.
is it set? And then I need a new one for the second one. Can I add it in later? Because obviously growing families, you know,
Yeah.
plannings and whatnot, or maybe not plannings. Yeah, do you have any
Oh, look, it's actually
thoughts?
that flexible that you can add a beneficiary onto the bond after you start it. In fact, you can even have an education bond with no education beneficiaries. You can always add them later. We get hopeful parents, hopeful grandparents that just want to get ready for them when they arrive. The intent was to add an education beneficiary. Even if one doesn't come around, that's okay. It just keeps going forward as a regular investment bond in that sense. You can still access the capital and take the earnings out tax-free after 10 years. But that's the beauty of that. You can add them as you go.
So then my next question to you was going to be, when should I start this bond? But by the sounds of it, you can start it even when they're not here, so to
Yeah,
speak.
yeah. Ideally, the earlier the better. So you've got a longer time frame to build up the earnings. But if there's education costs in the future, whether it's high school or university or even postgraduate studies, you're not too late if your children are already in school, already in high school. It can be used to fund university expenses, or it can be also used, I didn't mention this earlier, but it can be used for any other purposes as well. So if you've got a home deposit goal for the children in the future, they can have the earnings and the capital after that 10-year mark for other life goals, especially that home deposit, which is quite topical at the moment, helping the next generation buy their first home. The education bond can fund other life events as well. So these bonds are 10 plus year strategies. So ideally, there's a 10-year time horizon ahead.
Hmm.
You can always obviously withdraw before that 10-year mark, but to get the full tax benefits, we always recommend minimum time frame 10 years.
Love it. Too easy. So it's a tax-friendly environment to invest in that gives us a bit of, well, a lot of flexibility and options when it comes to, schooling,
Mm.
even if you haven't decided whether it's independent, Catholic, or public.
Mm.
So there's lots of features and things to consider, even being able to choose your own investments within the bond as well, making sure
Correct.
that aligns to your level, your appetite to risk if you decide to go down the path of one of these bonds.
That's it. That's correct, Nick.
Lovely. And bonds is, or the education bond is one option that's available when it comes to education funding and costing. But there are a few other options that we can look at. I guess a lot of people just put money away in their savings account and hopefully get a higher interest rate or a higher interest savings account to then cover costs in the future.
Yeah,
Um,
that's one way of doing it. Yeah.
yeah, and in terms of, a few of the alternatives, an offset account or a share portfolio,
Mm.
um, the benefits, who would, I guess, benefit from a bond like this compared to those other
Mm.
alternates?
So a person that would benefit would be basically parent, grandparent, or any other individuals that want to fund their own education. So it's available for mature students as well. But I think there's pros and cons with any option you go with. So I guess some pros for a savings account or if you're using an offset account is that it's easy to access the funds. Just like an education bond, we can offer that. There's no market risk because when you are investing through an education bond, you are accessing a list of different investment options through different fund managers, and there'll be some market risk there. So you can get some great gains, but then with volatility, it's a long-term strategy. So you do need to ride out any bumps along the way. So there's no market risk for savings and offset accounts, and then it's relatively low cost, which our bonds are competitively cost at a
Mhm.
competitive cost, but you do need to, I guess, weigh that up as well. So the cons for savings and offset accounts is that you're not getting any tax benefits for education funding, which an education bond can offer. So you do need to weigh up that whether the cost does outweigh the benefits, which I'm sure they would if you're using it in that way. And also with a savings account and offset account, there's temptation to use those funds for other purposes other than education funding. You can use our education bond for other purposes, but because it's a dedicated set apart structure for that, there's less temptation to dip in like you would with a savings account or an offset account. And the other con for having a savings or an offset account to fund education is that there is no investment growth. With a savings account, the interest rate you'd receive is, barely keeping up with the rate of inflation, currently at 4.6%. So your interest rate would need to be greater than that to combat that. But as we know, it's still increasing.
Hmm.
And the increase of the cost of education year on year is about that 6 to 7% mark. So the interest you're earning on a savings account may not keep up with the rising cost of education. And then, yeah, it's a different kind of benefit you're getting with an offset account when it's the interest that's offsetting your mortgage. So it's not that comparable, really.
Yeah.
But if you don't have a plan, a major con of just figuring it out later and seeing how you go is that if you don't have that plan to combat the rise in school fees early on, you might not have enough saved or invested to keep your child in the same school that they've started the journey with. You
Hmm.
may have to pull them out halfway through high school, put them in a more affordable high school, which can really impact the emotional well-being with that child having to make new friends. Could also negatively impact the academic performance. So, yeah, best way is to actually have a plan.
Hmm. 100%, 100%. And the only other, not only other, but one of the other alternates is grandparents gifting school fees or gifting
Oh, yes.
every year.
Yes.
Um, and, get advice to see which option is best for you. But one
Mm,
of the benefits of a bond or an education bond is around your estate planning
yeah,
benefits, being able to transfer across to the child or whatnot if the grandparent is no longer here from an estate planning point of view.
that's correct. So grandparents just gifting money to the grandchildren or, yeah, through the adult children, they do lose control over that funds on when they get the money and in the future if they're no longer here. So, like you said, the education bond does have very handy estate planning features that can control who and when they get that money, even after the bond owner's passed away.
Cool.
So it operates very similar to a trust. You can have a bond guardian act like a trustee on that bond after the bond owner dies and be able to access money on behalf of the beneficiaries. So there's all these great estate planning features that help give that bond owner peace of mind that that money will be used the way they want it to be used after they've passed away. And even during their lifetime, they've got full control over that bond money. They can even use it for themselves. So if you need a structure that offers control, tax benefits, and even flexibility, the education bond is really good for that.
Love it, love it. Um, and in terms of tips around bonds, education, funding. I guess we've already said throughout this podcast, starting early is always the best way to go about it, because then you've got a longer term horizon to build up the funds, to get the investment earnings, to have the nest egg to fund fees again, whether it is primary school and you're starting to, send your child to an independent or Catholic school that might be a bit more expensive, or whether it is into high school, and I guess you've got that time frame to decide on what you want to do and what is best for them.
That's correct. So starting early is, yeah, obviously ideal, but we have bond owners starting their bonds, like I said, when children are already in high school. So they're teenagers, but they're thinking university, other life events, home deposit pathways through the bond. So as long as, like I said, you've got the 10 years, it can be justified to start a little later. And I guess another tip is to get advice. You can go and get a bond directly through the Futurity website. However, seeking a financial advisor can help you navigate all the tax features and estate planning features more thoroughly. So, yeah, get advice.
Yeah, getting advice is, yeah, what I'd suggest as well. Because, yeah, again, everything we've spoken about today, it's all just general information on education bonds and what they are and how they can work, and how they might be structured for individuals. But before making any decisions, you need to test it with your scenario, your specifics, your salary holdings, how many kids you got, and the like. So don't go off and action anything based off this podcast until you get advice. Um, the last topic that I have on my list here is again the budget because
Hmm.
yeah, everyone's again freaking out about changes to family trusts, capital gains, negative
Yeah.
gearing, all of the fun stuff. And who knows where that ends up anyway. It's just proposed and
Yes,
who knows?
correct.
Maybe by the time this podcast comes out, there might be even more changes because
I
changes
know.
seem to happen all the time.
Well, that
Um, but yeah, does anything in the budget, not just capital gains, affect an education bond?
no, it doesn't actually. So, like I mentioned, a bond provider is paying the tax internally. So there is a maximum tax rate of 30%. That hasn't changed since the budget. However, with discretionary trusts from the 1st of July 2028, there will be a minimum 30% tax applied to discretionary trusts. So we're paying at max 30 and it can be less than that, but with a trust it starts at 30. So you should be able to save tax going through a bond. And also the earnings are retained in an education bond. We are paying tax on the earnings internally, but with a trust, the earnings eventually have to be distributed to a beneficiary. So that could cause unwanted tax events. They might get credits depending on their marginal tax rate. But simply put, the earnings are retained in an education bond and then only distributed if the bond owner wants to make withdrawals. So that makes it a simpler and also more tax effective option in terms of structures. And if you do use it for education, those earnings, you're going to get 30% tax back. So these are tax benefits that aren't available to a discretionary trust. And then the CGT, I did mention that that internal tax rate that we apply to the earnings already has all that built in, and that should marginally not even change at all post budget if it all gets legislated. But you can always access the capital tax free. So that's really important. It's not as easy getting funds out of other investable assets tax free, but we offer that. And there's no CGT if the bond owner passes away. There's no death tax that you can sometimes get. For instance, superannuation, if there's a taxable component, there's death tax. No death tax on bonds and education bonds. No CGT on transferring the ownership. So that's also very important. That remains unchanged after the budget proposal. And no CGT on investment switches either. So there are a lot of no CGT benefits on our education bonds. So even though, yeah, the budget proposal has come out, it really doesn't impact education bonds.
That's good to know. So it affects lots of other things, but education bonds, investment bonds are untouched.
Yeah.
So it doesn't add any more complexity to a scenario that seems pretty complex with a couple of things that they've got to iron out still.
That's very correct.
But yeah, thanks for joining me today, Marie. That's a wrap on the Wealth Builder podcast. Yeah, thanks for chatting
Thank you.
through education funding, and education bonds and the like.
Yes. My
And yeah,
pleasure. Thank you for having me, Nick. And like we said, advice is always very key. But if you do want more information, just doing your own research, we do have a website that's quite handy for that, www.futurityinvest.com.au. And there's also a handy cost of education calculator if you want to work out what the school fee is going to look like for your child, depending on what state you're in and depending on what school you want to go to. So that's also a handy tool to use.
thanks for giving us a tip on those tools and whatnot. And yeah, thanks to everyone for listening along. If you like today's episode, feel free to drop us a message or share it with someone you might know who might find this conversation valuable. But yeah, I look forward to bringing you the next episode in a fortnight's time. Until then, have a great day.